A racist officer shoves his boot into a black teenager's mouth, unaware that the boy's father is a high-ranking Army general. What happens next will leave you speechless. The humid evening air hung thick over the dimly lit streets, clinging to every surface with an oppressive weight. 17-year-old Marcus Holloway walked alone, his breath steady, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his hoodie. His long strides carried him at a casual pace, though there was an edge of alertness to the way his eyes flickered over his surroundings. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour, the occasional car rolling past, its headlights slicing through the darkness before vanishing into the distance. The rhythmic sound of his sneakers scraping lightly against the pavement was the only noise accompanying him. He had taken the long way home after a basketball game at the local court, his mind still replaying the final shots, the way the ball had swished cleanly through the net, the echo of sneakers pivoting against concrete. It had been a good game, the kind that made his body ache but left his spirit feeling lighter. But that lightness was fleeting, quickly replaced by something colder as the distant hum of an approaching vehicle broke through the night. A black and white police cruiser prowled along the curb, its presence an unwelcome shadow in the otherwise stillness of the street. The vehicle moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. The moment the bright red and blue lights flashed on, painting the asphalt in a chaotic swirl of color, Marcus knew this would not be just another quiet walk home. The air shifted, thickening with a familiar tension. He had seen this before, felt this before, the sudden weight in his chest, the tensing of his muscles, the cold realization that no matter what he did, this situation could spiral into something worse. The cruiser rolled to a stop just a few feet away, and the crackle of the car's loudspeaker split through the night, sharp and commanding. The voice was hard, authoritative, laced with a casual cruelty that made Marcus's stomach twist. The officer inside barked the order for him to take his hands out of his pockets. The words cut through the air with the force of a whip, a demand disguised as protocol but delivered with an undercurrent of suspicion. Marcus's fingers curled for a brief second before he slowly, carefully withdrew them, making sure his movements were measured, deliberate. He knew better than to move too quickly. The driver's side door of the cruiser swung open with a heavy creak, and Officer Travis Miller stepped out, the weight of his polished boots hitting the pavement with a dull thud. The way he moved spoke volumes. His posture exuded entitlement, the swagger of a man who carried authority not as a duty but as a weapon. His uniform was pressed and clean, but there was something ugly beneath the neatness, something simmering just beneath the surface. His face held a smirk, one that curled with a sense of arrogant amusement, the kind that suggested he had already made up his mind about Marcus before a single word had been spoken. Miller's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the teenager standing before him. He wasn't looking at a person. He was assessing a target. There was no curiosity in his gaze, no genuine concern or reasonable doubt. There was only judgment, the quick categorization of Marcus into something he could control, something he could dominate. The smirk deepened as he took a slow step forward, his hand resting on his belt, his fingers tapping against the holster in a silent warning. He questioned Marcus with a tone dripping in condescension, a sharp, venomous bite beneath the seemingly simple words. What was he doing out here? Why was he walking alone? Why did he look so suspicious? Each question was not really a question but an accusation, an attempt to poke and prod, to find something, anything, that could justify what was about to come next. Marcus swallowed the anger that threatened to rise, keeping his voice even as he responded. He was just heading home, nothing more. His words were calm, controlled, but he knew they would not be enough. They never were. Miller tilted his head slightly as if pretending to consider the response, though his mind had already been made up. His eyes flickered over Marcus's clothes, the loose hoodie, the slightly worn sneakers, the athletic shorts still slightly damp with sweat from the game. To Miller, none of it mattered. The color of Marcus's skin was all the reasoning he needed. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, before Miller suddenly moved, With a burst of force, he shoved Marcus against the hood of the police car, his hand pressing hard against the back of his neck, forcing him down. The impact sent a sharp jolt through Marcus's body, his cheek smacking against the cool metal, the rough surface scraping against his skin. A sharp hiss of pain slipped through his clenched teeth, but he remained still, refusing to give the officer any reason to escalate things further. Miller leaned in closer, his breath hot against the back of Marcus's ear. The weight of his knee dug into the small of his back, pinning him in place. He muttered something under his breath, words laced with mockery, amusement twisting in his tone. His grip tightened on Marcus's wrist before twisting it behind his back, wrenching it at an unnatural angle. A sharp, shooting pain shot up Marcus's arm, his fingers twitching involuntarily as he gritted his teeth against the discomfort. Miller clicked his tongue in mock disappointment, muttering something about resistance. His voice was laced with feigned exasperation, as if he were dealing with a stubborn child instead of a teenager being wrongfully detained. He twisted Marcus's arm further, the pain intensifying. Marcus barely managed to stifle a pained grunt, his breath coming out in short, controlled exhales. Miller wasn't listening to anything Marcus said. He didn't need to. He had already decided the story he would tell, the version of events that would make sense to him, to his colleagues, to anyone who asked. Marcus was just another criminal in his eyes, another suspect, another statistic waiting to be written. The truth didn't matter. Miller's voice took on a more mocking tone as he made assumptions about Marcus, assumptions laced with venom and the kind of deep-seated hatred that made Marcus's stomach churn. He was sure the boy had drugs on him. He was sure he was up to no good. He was sure he was just another thug pretending to be innocent. The words were sharp, slicing through the air like rusted knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. The pressure against Marcus's back increased as Miller yanked him upright, only to slam him back down against the hood again. The force knocked the wind from his lungs, his vision momentarily blurring as his body absorbed the impact. The cold metal beneath him seemed to burn against his skin, a cruel contrast to the suffocating heat in the air. His pulse pounded against his skull, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out everything else. He clenched his jaw, biting back the words he wanted to say, the anger and frustration coiling inside him like a caged animal. He knew better than to speak. He knew better than to fight. He knew that no matter how much pain he endured, how much humiliation he suffered, this officer would never see him as anything other than a problem to be handled. And Officer Miller wasn't done yet. Not even close. The alley was dark, a narrow strip of filth and neglect tucked away from the eyes of the world. The kind of place where things happened in silence, where screams might carry but never be answered. The distant hum of passing cars barely reached here, the soft buzz of streetlights too far away to offer anything but the faintest glow. The ground was slick with rot, the stench of old garbage seeping into the damp concrete, but none of it reeked as strongly as the unfiltered hatred radiating from Officer Travis Miller. He had chosen this spot carefully, dragging Marcus off the main road with the force of someone who had done this before, someone who had long since learned that power was best wielded in the dark, away from judgment, away from accountability. Marcus staggered as he was shoved forward, his feet scraping against the uneven ground before he lost his balance and went down, his body hitting the pavement hard. His palms scraped against the rough ground, bits of broken glass and debris digging into his skin, sending sharp bursts of pain through his hands. The impact sent a jolt through his spine, but he barely had time to process it before Miller loomed over him, his shadow stretching long in the dim light. Miller took a step closer, his boots crushing a discarded can beneath his heel with a sharp crunch. There was a deliberate slowness to the way he moved, a calculated ease that made it clear he wasn't in a hurry. This wasn't just about asserting authority. This was something else, something uglier. He bent slightly, his presence looming heavier, his breath thick with the stench of coffee and something metallic, like rusted cruelty left to fester too long. Then he spoke, his voice curling with mockery, laced with something venomous that made Marcus's stomach churn. He wanted to know if Marcus thought he was tough, if he thought he could walk through these streets without understanding his place, without knowing that people like him didn't get to move freely, didn't get to carry themselves with quiet confidence. Miller wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a statement, a warning. Marcus tightened his jaw, his fists clenching against the cold pavement, but he didn't respond. He knew words wouldn't help him here. Miller straightened, sucking his teeth in exaggerated disappointment at the silence. Then he laughed, a short, sharp sound that cut through the air like glass against stone. The amusement didn't reach his eyes. He shifted his weight, one hand resting on his belt where his baton sat clipped to his side, the other gripping the radio on his shoulder. But he didn't call anything in. He didn't press the button, didn't report an arrest, didn't request backup. This wasn't about law or order. This was about something personal, something primal. He wanted Marcus to know that this wasn't procedure. This was a lesson, a punishment, something just between them. His fingers curled around the handle of his baton, the metal glinting under the faint alley light as he drew it from his belt. The quiet rasp of it sliding free sent a fresh spike of tension through Marcus's chest, but he kept his breathing steady, refusing to give the officer the satisfaction of seeing his fear. Miller lifted the baton, its weight balanced easily in his grip, then brought it down with a slow, deliberate tap against Marcus's jaw. The cold metal pressed against his skin, firm but not yet brutal, teasing rather than striking. The officer tilted his head, studying him, as if considering something, as if searching for a reason to go further. His gaze swept over Marcus's face, over the tightness in his expression, the way his shoulders held firm even under the weight of humiliation. Then something in Miller's eyes changed, darkened, as if a particularly twisted idea had just taken root. He lifted his leg, shifting his weight slightly to balance himself. The boot, heavy and caked with grime, hovered inches from Marcus's face. The leather was scuffed, streaked with old dirt, the deep ridges in the sole packed with filth from the streets. Miller's stance widened slightly, his heels steady, the weight of his authority pressing down long before he even made contact. He gave Marcus a moment, just long enough for the realization to settle in, for the intention behind the gesture to become unmistakably clear. Then he spoke again, his voice carrying the weight of command. He told Marcus to open his mouth. For the first time, Marcus's composure wavered. His brows furrowed, his breath catching slightly as his mind tried to process what had just been ordered. A sliver of disbelief cut through the tension, a moment of hesitation that made his throat tighten. But Miller didn't repeat himself right away. He just let the words sit there, filling the alley like the stench of rot, poisoning the air between them. The boot remained in place, steady, unmoving, waiting. Then, when Marcus didn't respond, Miller's voice came again, sharper this time, the command splitting through the night like a whip. He ordered him again, each word separated, deliberate, leaving no room for confusion. Open your mouth. Marcus's hands curled into fists against the pavement. Every muscle in his body tensed, every fiber of his being screaming against the degradation that was unfolding, but he still didn't move. His breathing was sharp now, not from fear, but from rage, from a kind of helpless fury that coiled hot in his chest. He couldn't, he wouldn't, give this man what he wanted. But resistance, however small, was not something Miller tolerated. The officer's hand shot forward with brutal speed, fingers clamping around Marcus's jaw with bruising force. The grip was unrelenting, squeezing until Marcus felt the sharp sting of Miller's nails digging into his skin. The strength behind the hold made his teeth press together painfully, his jaw aching from the sheer force of it. Then, with a sickening grunt of effort, Miller pried his mouth open, forcing past clenched muscles, ignoring the strain, ignoring the involuntary resistance. The boot came down. The filthy leather pressed against Marcus's tongue, the taste of dirt and sweat flooding his senses with an overwhelming wave of disgust. The texture of it was rough, the grooves of the sole scraping against his mouth as Miller applied more pressure, grinding it in with slow, deliberate force. The weight of it was unbearable, the sheer humiliation sinking deep into his bones, a violation more profound than pain. His body reacted instinctively, his stomach twisting, his throat tightening as nausea clawed its way up from the pit of his gut. A gag rose unbidden, but Miller only pushed harder, the smirk returning to his lips as he shifted his weight ever so slightly, testing just how much Marcus could take before breaking. The pressure increased, his jaw straining under the force, his lips bruising against the unyielding leather. The world narrowed to the taste of filth, to the suffocating weight pressing him down, to the unbearable, suffocating reality that this moment would never leave him. Miller leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur, a mockery of something almost gentle. He told Marcus this was where he belonged, beneath his boot, under his control. He let the words settle, let them twist into something permanent, something that would linger long after this night ended. Then, just before Marcus thought his jaw might crack from the pressure, just before his vision blurred from the sheer, overwhelming weight of it all, Miller spoke again. His voice was quieter this time, but the venom was still there, coiled beneath the words like a hidden blade. He told Marcus to swallow his pride. He told him no one was coming to save him, and for a fleeting, gut-wrenching moment, Marcus believed him. Miller finally yanked his boot away, the sudden release leaving Marcus gasping as the unbearable pressure disappeared. His jaw throbbed, his tongue raw from the coarse, filthy leather that had been forced against it. His entire body remained stiff, his muscles locked in place as if bracing for another assault. He had not yet processed the full depth of what had just happened, had not yet allowed himself to feel the full weight of the humiliation. But Miller was not done with his final show of dominance. As if the act itself had not been enough, as if the degradation he had inflicted required one last mark of ownership, he wiped the saliva off the toe of his boot against Marcus's shirt. The fabric dampened immediately, the moisture seeping into his skin, a revolting reminder of his submission. The smirk that curled Miller's lips was one of self-satisfaction, of victory. His breath came slow and steady, his stance relaxed, his eyes gleaming with the pleasure of a man who had done exactly what he had intended and had gotten away with it. The air in the alley was thick with the scent of garbage and sweat, but something shifted. A disturbance, a ripple in the suffocating silence. Then, voices. The sharp, unmistakable sound of tires screeching against asphalt shattered the stillness. The roar of an engine filled the night, growing louder as a second patrol car rounded the corner at alarming speed. Its headlights flooded the alley, slicing through the darkness, casting Miller's shadow long and grotesque against the walls. The vehicle came to an abrupt halt, the momentum rocking it slightly before both doors flung open. There was no hesitation. Heavy boots slammed against the pavement, each step ringing with purpose, with authority. The echoes bounced off the alley walls, a rhythm of impending judgment. Marcus, still crumpled on the ground, barely lifted his head, his mind too fogged with exhaustion and humiliation to comprehend what was happening. But Miller heard it. Miller felt it. His smirk faltered for the first time that night. His posture stiffened, his shoulders tensing as an unfamiliar unease settled in his chest. He had not expected an audience. He had not expected interruption. Then, from the blinding headlights, a tall figure emerged, his silhouette crisp, his uniform pristine even in the dim alley light. Every movement was controlled, deliberate, carrying a weight that Miller immediately recognized. The moment his gaze fully settled on the man standing before him, his breath hitched, his grip unconsciously tightening at his sides. Recognition struck like a bullet. The presence in front of him was not just any man, not just any officer. General Elijah Holloway, Marcus's father. The weight of his name alone carried an unshakable authority, one that Miller could not ignore, one that made the blood drain from his face in an instant. The storm in General Holloway's expression was contained, but it was there, burning behind sharp eyes that swept over the scene before him with terrifying precision. His gaze flicked first to his son, to the bruised and broken figure on the ground, the boy who had once been untouchable in his father's eyes. Marcus did not move, barely reacted, his entire body still trapped in the trauma of the last few minutes, still frozen in the filth of that alley. But the general saw everything: the state of his son's clothes, the dirt smudged against his skin, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly at his sides, and then the final confirmation, the dark streak of moisture on his shirt, a repulsive reminder of what had just occurred. The general's chest rose with a deep inhale, a slow, measured intake of air meant to keep his emotions in check. Then his gaze lifted to Miller. There was no shouting, no immediate eruption of fury. When General Holloway spoke, his voice was dangerously calm, the kind of quiet that cut deeper than any raised volume. He addressed Miller by name, his tone steady, lacking warmth but also lacking hysteria. The kind of voice that demanded an answer, that left no room for anything but the absolute truth. He asked what exactly Miller thought he was doing to his son. The question was simple, but the weight of it pressed down like a mountain. Miller's lips parted, but no sound came. For the first time that night, words failed him. The confident, arrogant man who had tormented Marcus mere moments ago now stood speechless, his throat working as if attempting to conjure an excuse, a justification, something that could explain away the inexcusable. But nothing came. His mind scrambled for a lie, for a defense, but he knew there was none. He was finished, and he knew it. The authority he had wielded so freely before now felt hollow in his grasp. The badge on his chest, the uniform that had granted him unchecked power, now felt like a noose tightening around his neck. Then came the movement. The other officers, ones Miller had not even registered arriving, stepped in, their presence swift, efficient. Before he could so much as flinch, before he could process what was happening, his arms were wrenched behind his back. The sudden force sent him stumbling, his weight shifting too fast to adjust. He barely had time to gasp before his body was slammed into the hood of his own cruiser, the metal biting against his cheek. The irony was not lost on him. The position he had forced Marcus into earlier was now his own, the cold surface pressing against his skin, his limbs twisted at an unnatural angle. He had done this so many times before, had felt the power of it, had seen the helplessness in the eyes of the people beneath him. But now that he was the one pressed down, the one with his breath restricted, the one whose fate was no longer in his own hands, panic settled into his bones. The metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists was deafening. The sensation of cold steel locking in place sent a jolt through him, an unfamiliar terror creeping up his spine. He had worn these cuffs before, but never like this, never from this side. His voice finally found itself, but it came out fractured, desperate. He stammered, his words tumbling over each other in an attempt to salvage what could not be salvaged. He tried to explain, to insist that this was a misunderstanding, that there was an explanation, that he had only been doing his job. But the words were empty, meaningless. No one was listening. General Holloway did not spare Miller another glance. His focus remained on his son. He moved toward Marcus, his steps slow but steady, his presence still imposing but softened now by something else: concern. He kneeled beside him, lowering himself with care, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter what little composure Marcus had left. His hands, so accustomed to issuing orders, to handling weapons, to commanding men, were gentle as they reached for his son. His fingers found Marcus's arm, his touch firm but reassuring as he lifted him slightly, supporting his weight. The contrast between father and officer was stark. Where Miller's hands had only inflicted pain, the general's held steady warmth. Where Miller had sought to break, the general sought to restore. But despite the safety, despite the shift in power, Marcus did not fully return to the moment. His body allowed itself to be moved, but his mind remained elsewhere, still trapped in the filth of that alley, still feeling the phantom weight of that boot against his tongue, the taste of humiliation that would not fade. The general's voice dropped to something quieter, something meant only for his son. He told Marcus that he was safe now. The words were meant to be comforting, meant to ground him, to assure him that the nightmare was over. But Marcus only stared past him, his eyes unfocused, distant. Safe. The word felt hollow. The dirt was still on his clothes, the taste still in his mouth, the weight of what had happened still crushing him from the inside. The man who had tormented him had been taken away, but the damage had already been done. He would never forget this night. And as General Holloway held his son in the cold, dark alley, he knew, neither would he. The news spread like wildfire, a storm of outrage igniting across television screens, social media feeds, and newspaper headlines. The images were everywhere. Grainy body cam footage, leaked security recordings, even bystander phone clips. Each frame a damning indictment of Officer Travis Miller, each second of footage an unfiltered glimpse into the raw cruelty that had unfolded in that alley. The world watched in horror as the truth came to light. They saw Marcus Holloway, young and defenseless, dragged into the shadows, brutalized, humiliated beyond what words could describe. They saw Miller's smirk, the casual malice in his posture, the arrogance in the way he wielded his authority like a weapon. They saw the boot, caked in filth, forcing its way into Marcus's mouth, grinding down with merciless weight. They heard the taunts, the venomous commands, the sick amusement in Miller's voice as he made a sport of another man's suffering. And then they saw the reckoning. The moment Miller was ripped from his pedestal, his power stripped away, the smugness draining from his face as General Elijah Holloway arrived. It was a scene that could not be spun, could not be softened, could not be denied. The outrage was immediate and unstoppable. Protests erupted overnight, voices rising in unison, demanding justice, demanding consequences, demanding change. The footage replayed endlessly, each viewing fueling the fire of public fury. Political figures condemned the act, community leaders held vigils, activists flooded the streets, their chants shaking the foundations of a system that had allowed men like Miller to operate unchecked for far too long. There was no spinning this, no narrative to twist in Miller's favor. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an unfortunate accident. This was an atrocity, played out in real time for the entire world to witness. Miller was dragged before the courts, a man who once carried himself with unchecked confidence now reduced to something smaller, something weaker, something that no longer held power over anyone. His badge was stripped from him in a quiet, bureaucratic ceremony that carried none of the weight of the crimes he had committed. There was no honor in his departure, no final salute, no words of gratitude for his years of service. There was only silence, only the weight of disgrace pressing down on him as the very institution that had once protected him now turned its back. He was no longer an officer of the law. He was no longer untouchable. He was just another disgraced name on an ever-growing list of men who had abused their power and had finally been forced to answer for it. There were no plea deals, no negotiations for leniency, no backroom compromises. The evidence was too damning, the public scrutiny too intense. The courts had no choice but to treat him as the criminal he was. The trial was swift, the outcome inevitable. He sat in the defendant's chair, his face pale, his jaw clenched, his hands gripping the table as the prosecution dismantled his career, his defense, his entire existence. Witnesses were called, footage was played, and each piece of evidence added another nail to the coffin of his life as he knew it. The world he had built for himself, one where he could act without consequence, where he could brutalize and walk away without a second thought, crumbled beneath the weight of undeniable truth. But for Marcus, the scars remained. No court ruling, no conviction, no prison sentence could undo what had been done to him. His father did everything in his power. Lawsuits filed against the department, Press conferences where he stood with Marcus at his side, his voice steady, his words sharp, each syllable carrying the weight of a man who had spent his life fighting battles that could not be lost. He condemned the system that had allowed this to happen, the policies that had shielded men like Miller, the culture of silence that had permitted abuse to fester in the shadows. He fought not just for his son, but for all those who had suffered the same way, for the names that never made it to the headlines, for the victims whose voices had been stolen before they could ever be heard. The legal victories were many. The settlement was substantial. Policies were reevaluated, training programs overhauled, disciplinary measures reinforced. But none of it could erase that moment in the alley. None of it could scrub the taste of leather and dirt from Marcus's memory, could take back the feeling of helplessness as he lay on the ground, could undo the humiliation that had seared itself into his bones. No amount of money could buy back his sense of safety, his sense of self. He never played basketball again. The game that had once been his refuge, his escape, now felt tainted. The court no longer felt like a place of freedom, but a reminder of the night he had been walking home, sweaty and tired, thinking only of the hoops he had sunk and the laughter of his friends. Now, the thought of dribbling a ball, of hearing the echo of sneakers against pavement, brought back too much. The fear, the helplessness, the memory of flashing lights, the sound of a voice ordering him to stop, the feeling of cold metal against his cheek. He never walked home alone again. The route that had once been familiar, the streets that had once belonged to him, were now territories of uncertainty, places where shadows stretched too long, where every pair of headlights felt like a threat. His father offered to have him driven everywhere, to ensure he never had to be alone, never had to feel exposed again. And Marcus accepted, because the alternative, the idea of walking those streets without the protection of a vehicle, of knowing that someone like Miller could be out there again, was unbearable. The fear lingered, settling deep within him, becoming a part of him. It was not the kind of fear that made itself obvious, not the kind that sent him running or screaming. It was quieter than that, more insidious. It was the hesitation before stepping outside after dark. It was the stiffness in his shoulders when a patrol car passed by. It was the way his breath would catch in his throat when he heard the sound of heavy boots against pavement. It was the knowledge that no matter what had happened to Miller, no matter how much justice had been served, there would always be more of them. More men who saw him as nothing but a target. More men who carried the same smirk, who wielded the same authority, who believed in their untouchability. But he did promise himself one thing. He would never, ever let someone put him beneath their boot again. That moment in the alley had stolen something from him, had stripped him of his dignity, had left a wound that no ruling, no speech, no protest could fully heal. But it had also given him something else: resolve, a fire that would not die, a refusal to ever be powerless again. He would carry that night with him, yes, but he would also carry the promise he had made in the depths of his suffering. Never again. No matter what it took, no matter what he had to do, no matter how long it took to rebuild himself, he would make sure of that.